Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Friday, June the 18th, 2021. I'd like to begin by wishing all my American viewers a happy, long Juneteenth weekend. But of course, that's too narrow, too grudging, isn't it? Juneteenth is truly a universal celebration. However, there are some people who are not happy with this. For instance, Nika M. O'Kona, or Afro Sapella, on Twitter. She's from Little Rock, Arkansas, and she tweets, "White people having Juneteenth off really don't sit right with my spirit." Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. It's never enough. It's never enough. I mean, it's clear that Juneteenth is not a holiday offered in the spirit of reconciliation, if you will. It is instead simply another tribute. And it's like Kipling said about the Danegeld. Okay, we have this tribute. What is next? Yes, symbolic gestures are well and good. But what's next? What's more to come? Well, let's go to the New York Times. And perhaps that will provide us an answer. Here is a piece from Kevin Young, who is the Andrew W. Mellon Director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture and Poetry Editor of The New Yorker. Yes, he says, it's a national holiday, but will it remain a Black holiday? I think it's quite possible that national holidays have now been segregated in the United States, as I've been saying for quite some time. Black people, Black Americans, or at least the Black American elite, has decided that it is no longer American. It is simply Black, because, of course, America is a wicked country in their view and always has been. So I suppose we'll have Juneteenth for the Black folk and July the 4th for the white folk. Kevin Young begins, "We might count Juneteenth among those things Black people have long enjoyed that white folks don't know about, like Frankie Beverly and Mays." Well, he's got me there. I don't know. I don't know who Frankie Beverly and Mays are. He continues, "The fact that such things exist might still be a shock to some. Americans are used to having Black culture to draw on like a renewable well. But no matter how aware or steeped in Black music and meanings, white people can still be surprised by the depth of things that Black people have kept alive for generations, kept to themselves in churches and barbershops, beauty salons and artistic salons, or laughed about over barbecue and red drink. These are the habits of freedom, rituals of the heart and mind. There's a whole canon of Black cookout music that folks sing along to if you're lucky enough to get invited." He then explains that Juneteenth is not the same as the Emancipation Proclamation. But in any event, it is a holiday ringed like a good brisket, though not in smoke, but irony. Wow, some pretty fancy language from this fella. Out of such ironies, Black people have made the blues, made lemonade, made good. The lesson of Juneteenth is both of celebration and expectation of freedom deferred, but still sought, and of the freedoms to come. And then he talks about his Louisiana-born mother celebrating a Juneteenth as a child, eating homemade ice cream. I don't know whether I believe him. It's, this could well be a folk myth, but never mind. But last year, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and delayed justice for Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and too many others whose names have become sadly familiar, this promise of freedom and its frustrations took on more urgency. Protests filled the streets, and Floyd's image was painted not just on his namesake square in Minneapolis, but also as far away as the Berlin Wall, that symbol of division that came down over 3 decades ago. Americans haven't a wall or its fragments to show us how far we've come, We have other kinds of ruins to tend to. Yes, well, wait until Stone Mountain and Mount Rushmore get dynamited. As Juneteenth approaches, it is time to address those ruins, according to Kevin Young. You could say that the original Juneteenth marks just the start, not just the start of freedom, but also the short-lived promise and of the period of reconstructure. And then we get the myth of massacres in Tulsa 100 years ago. Against that backdrop, I am reminded of a question I should have asked a lot lately in the run-up to the holiday. Should Juneteenth become a national holiday, as our elected officials just decided it should? I believe the answer is yes. But there remains a caveat and another question. When Juneteenth becomes a national holiday, will it still remain Black? Can it be both serious and playful and recognized as the poet Toi Derricotte reminds us that joy is an act of resistance? No, it isn't. No, it isn't. Can we cook and laugh while we remember, remaining rooted in tradition while telling the full story of America and Black life in it? I believe in an America, Kevin Young writes, that can do all of those things when we know and accept the unvarnished truth in all of its complexity, conflict, and context. It can change how we view things, including ourselves. The National Museum of African American History and Culture, an institution I have the privilege of leading, is proof of that. In chronicling the American story through the lens of African Americans across the centuries, the museum has drawn large crowds of all races. Yes, this museum has drawn large crowds of all races because they have gone there involuntarily, bussed in by school administrators. We at the museum are keenly aware that history should not just be a record of what happened. It should also be a record of how we remember what happened, and how too often memory and testimony have been elided in favor of fear and fantasy. Okay, I don't know what that means. Perhaps the commemorations from Tulsa to Texas should remind us of the threats that shadowed emancipation long after slavery was legally over, and that we need more than just one day to call our attention to freedoms delayed and denied. Maybe what we need is an emancipation season. Okay, there's already Black History Month, but I suppose the Blacks are a little jealous of the alphabet people who have, it's true, their own season. Or I can almost hear my late father say, just plain old full-throated freedom would be nice. Certainly, it would be tremendous to collectively celebrate not just the nation's freedom from foreign rule, as we do on Independence Day, but also our release from the tyranny of slavery. That's exactly what Juneteenth is, Mr. Young. African Americans should not have to bear the burden of this history alone, nor should Black achievement be something that only African Americans celebrate. As James Baldwin well knew, our freedoms are interrelated and otherwise imperiled. Walking my new town of Washington, D.C., I'm struck by how such interconnectedness was expressed by giants like Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Martin Luther King Jr., whose monuments etched with their eloquent words express that principle often. Like Juneteenth, that soaring space on the National Mall, which took over a century after it was first proposed to build, reminds us that freedom is not free. More than that, as Toni Morrison put it, the function of freedom is to free someone else. Is it now? Juneteenth tells us that a fuller future awaits and the work of collective freedom is ongoing. If you're lucky, you'll get to stay till the end of the cookout, which is not complete without Frankie, Beverly, and Maze. When Frankie or Beyonce begins to sing, I want to make sure I'm right before I let you go, you best dance as soon enough the party is over. Time to clean up. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I noticed that someone, apparently Stephen Colbert, was carrying on and on about a Juneteenth and how very important it was. And someone pointed out that until Juneteenth was made a national holiday, what was that, yesterday, Stephen Colbert had never once mentioned it on his show. But I'm sure he was feeling it in his heart. Perhaps he thought that, I don't know, he would be angering the wrong people if he were to celebrate Juneteenth on its legacy. on his show, because as we well know, the people who watch late night television are ferociously reactionary. David Burge, who I've come across over the years and apparently is a leading conservative thinker, responded to Charlie Kirk rather churlishly. Kirk wrote, Lincoln knew America's founding was July the 4th, 1776. He knew that was the day our amazing nation made a step from ideal to reality. Juneteenth is an affront to the unity of July the 4th. We now have 2 summer holidays, and one of them based on race. Shame on the GOP for supporting this. I'm going to have to indulge in some profanity here because the powerful, moving, coruscating words of David Burge won't fully resonate with you unless I do. Juneteenth is a wonderful patriotic holiday that should be celebrated by all Americans, and furthermore, fuck you, you fucking fuck. Isn't this just conservatism in one tweet? That thing that you never heard of until the day before yesterday is now as American as apple pie, and you had better get on your feet and cheer. You had better, or else you're not going to be part of our movement anymore. Here's a story from Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News. A new report claims that President Trump blamed Jared Kushner for pandering to the blacks, who Trump thought were never going to vote for him anyway because they all fucking hate me. The claim is made by Michael C. Bender, senior White House reporter for the Wall Street Journal, in his new book, Frankly, We Did Win This Election, The Inside Story of How Trump Lost. According to Bender, Trump blamed Kushner for his messaging in response to months of Black Lives Matter riots and mayhem, which Bender describes as a civil unrest, not connecting with Americans. The report claims that Trump thought the law and order message, which proved so successful in 2016, had been diluted by Kushner's push for criminal justice reform, which actually had the consequence of making Trump look weak when the riots began and didn't earn him any goodwill amongst African-American voters. Well, as it turns out, Trump got a higher share of the Black American vote last November than he did in 2016. But in the event, I don't believe a single supposed quote from the regime media from Donald J. Trump. They have been lying about him without end from 2015, telling us, oh, Trump has privately told people that he is only running for president in order to burnish his brand, that he has no interest in becoming president, and if he were nominated, he would not run. Yes, we heard this. People apparently had heard Trump say this, and thousands, tens of thousands of lies from the regime media followed. Speaking of reparations, Catherine Hamilton reports on Breitbart. Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot, you might remember her deranged email to staff, where she repeated the same sentence. In one case 5 times, in one case 13 times, in one case 16 times. But now she has declared racism a public health emergency on Thursday and promised to divert $10 million in coronavirus relief to create equity zones, according to the Daily Mail. Ladies and gentlemen, it is literally killing us, Lightfoot said during a news conference in front of an exhibit honoring the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the west side of Chicago. Lightfoot made the announcement following a report from the city public health department, which found that non-Black residents live to be 80.6 years on average, while Black residents on average live 71.4 years. The racial life expectancy gap in Chicago is written by 5 factors, and she lists them, the mayor: chronic diseases like diabetes, homicide, infant mortality, HIV, flu, and other infections such as COVID-19, and opioid overdose. Yes, and of course, diabetes, which in most of these cases follows from morbid obesity, is white people's fault. Black people shooting each other in the hundreds of thousands in Chicago obviously is the fault of white people. Infant mortality, well, generalized health, which is truly worse among Black people than white people. HIV, flu, and other infectious COVID-19, Black people having a higher rate of death from COVID-19. Again, morbid obesity, diabetes, heart disease, et cetera, and opioid overdose. And of course, the white man is forcing the Black man to overdose on drugs, or so Mayor Lori, the Shining Lightfoot, would have it. Let's have a look at the chat. Hello to Dan, Pitsky, Anrun, Jogakin 666. Anrun says the Rosenbergs got what they deserved on June 19th, so it is not all bad. Pitsky says whites work double shift for Juneteenth. Dan Allison says hello, KMG Nation. Justin Proto, something I hadn't heard of till last year, and I'm approaching 40. Hello to Eche Lux. Chokakin 666 says, ask any Black person under 50 who Otis Redding is. Popcasso 88 says of Juneteenth, same thing. 45, and I'd never heard of it until last year. Hauper says, I only knew it as the title of Ralph Ellison's long-delayed second novel. Chokakin 666 says, I heard of it. They destroy the ghettos of Miami on it. It's a Southern thing. Hauper says, holiday and Wakanda. Hello to Texas Feral Hog, who says Juneteenth is an awesome, positive holiday for Blacks celebrating freedom, life, and abundance. Chokakin 666 says, at least in Cuba, the celebration of Africanismo isn't tinged with resentment and race hatred. Neil Terry says there has to be a way to get over reactionitarianism. Okay. Anren says, I wonder how Mayor Beetlejuice and her white wife will celebrate a Juneteenth. Oh, Texas Feral Hog says there has been a push on to make JT a national holiday, but there has been much pushback from the left because the boot to skulls Nazis wanted to make the day Lee surrendered a national holiday. Is aquarium a euphemism? Is this a reference to Mayor Lightfoot demanding more aquarium time? That's a joke I saw. Let's talk now about goldsmiths, which is part of the University of London, described by Wikipedia as a public research university. It was founded in 1891 as Goldsmiths Technical and Recreative Institute by the Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths in New Cross, London. Nearly 20% of students come from outside the UK, and 52% of all undergraduates are mature students. Around a third of students at Goldsmiths are postgraduate students. Well, Goldsmith is blazing a trail for the academic world. They have lit a fire which shall never be extinguished. And what that fire is, according to Jack Montgomery at Breitbart, Goldsmiths has bowed to pressure from student activists and agreed to let BIPOC students defer essays on grounds of racial trauma based purely on self-certification. The uni has agreed to our sabbatical officer's proposal to include racial trauma as a reason to defer essays for BIPOC students through self-certification, not an evidence-based approach, crowed the Goldsmiths Student Union on social media. This is great news and a step in the right direction. Well done to those involved in discussions. The proposal appears to be the brainchild of one Sarah Baffo, described on the union's website as its welfare and liberation officer, who confirmed that the deferral process will indeed be done through self-certification, moving away from providing so much evidence. Isn't the evidence of lived experience enough? Isn't that's all we have ever needed? lived experiences. Ms. Bafo appears to have extremely strong political views, describing both the United Kingdom and the United States as imperialist white supremacist nations and Israel as a settler colonial state. May we see a free and liberated Palestine in our lifetime. May those who have suffered under a settler colonial state experience true justice in our lifetime, she declares in the pinned message on her Twitter account, which has gone private since this story was written, adding somewhat chillingly, may every oppressive ruler suffer the consequence of their actions in this lifetime and the next. So I went to the staff list and contacts at Goldsmiths, and I see 4 pictures, and they are all women. And 3 of them are Black, and 2 of them with African names. Now, if it is true that Black students at Goldsmiths are suffering racial trauma because of their exposure to white people and their nefarious supremacy, well, there is an easy way for them to divest themselves of this trauma, which is back to Africa. I don't suppose there's much suffering from white supremacy in Nigeria, say. So perhaps that should be considered, because obviously any attempts to ameliorate the evils of white supremacy and the trauma attendant upon it are going to be unavailing. They're going to be unavailing. So long as white people exist and have their own countries, this trauma will remain. And as we have seen, it's only going to become stronger, despite all the so-called reconciliation and tribute. This is from InfoWars. A New Jersey student penned a letter to his former teacher describing how critical race theory lessons adopted at his school negatively affected his mental state. In a letter shared by Black Columbia University professor John McWhorter on Twitter Wednesday, the unidentified white male student praised his former English teacher, Dana Stangl-Plow, a whistleblowing educator who resigned in the face of her school's anti-white agenda. I'm going to read the letter in full. Dear Mrs. Stangl-Plow, I truly hope you do read this email, but I understand if you are too busy to. I'm extremely grateful that you were my teacher this year and for the ideas you finally brought to light recently. I hope you realize how big of an impact you made on our community. Unfortunately, all of what you said is true. I know many students that are scared to speak out on their opinions in fear. I have reluctantly prohibited myself from saying certain things in class, also in fear of sounding politically incorrect. I see the negative effects of this toxic community in my fellow students and faculty every day. Namely, my 8th grade English teacher taught us for the first 2 weeks about pretty much how awful white men are. For 2 weeks, I did not speak a single word in her class. My fellow white male classmates left the classroom every time feeling the same way. For lack of a better word, those teachings made me feel like horseshit, like worthless scum, undeserving of living. Later, during that year, in my history class, my white classmates were constantly using the pronoun we when talking about slavery. Eventually, I had to raise my hand and remind them that we were not and are not a part of these despicable acts. Most of our parents were refugees from foreign countries whose ancestors were also oppressed and persecuted. This year, I have battled with countless generalizing and oppression towards white men. There are girls who I am friends with that genuinely believe that all men are misogynistic. I see movements on social media like KAM, which stands for Kill All Men. People don't realize how strongly that affects boys in an extremely negative way. Even now, I am struggling and frightened to fully express my opinion to my girlfriend who believes that most white men are oppressive beings. Everyone is talking about your letter. Many students, including myself, are extremely grateful for what you've done. My friends and classmates feel much more comfortable expressing their voices and many minds are changing. So I am once again thanking you for trying to improve our school. I wish I could put into words the extent to which I admire and thank you. I wish I could describe to you the good that you have done. I aspire to be as brave as you someday, with endless amounts of love and respect. your former student. Well, okay. People don't realize how strongly that affects boys in an extremely negative way. No, but they do understand it. They do understand how it affects boys, and especially white boys and white people generally. That is the whole point of critical racial theory. The whole point is to demonize and to shame and to make them feel worthless. I'm going to be talking about Stanley Bing's dystopian science fiction novel, Immortal Life, at 5:30 Pacific, and he goes into that. The punishment is not necessary in this glorious transhumanist future, because you can merely point shame rays at people, which is the collected negativity of social media towards those people who have unapproved opinions. And of course, Bing's novel came out, 4 or 5 years ago. We have pretty much reached that state. You know, when this whole political correctness business started, there were many people who said, oh, these people, you know, their heart is in the right place, but no, just stop there with the but, because their hearts are not in the right place, and they never have been. They mean to destroy us. That is not hyperbole. Oh, let's see what's happening in terms of white supremacy in Canada. This is from Janet French of the CBC. Alberta Social Studies Curriculum Advisor says Kamloops unmarked burial site, no evidence of genocide. Well, there's no evidence of the evidence because the Kamloops Indian Band said on the 28th of last month that a survey had been done, an X-ray survey had been done. This X-ray survey has not been released. We don't know who did the survey. We have no evidence whatsoever, just a claim. And even if it's true, 215 bodies are buried in a mass grave. Who are these bodies? How did they get there? There is not going to be an exhumation. The Kamloops Indian Band has made that clear. Yes, Chris Champion says unmarked graves of Indigenous children, no comparison to the Holocaust. I must say, I've known Chris Champion for about 25 years. I worked with him at Alberta Report. I have written a couple of pieces for his journal, the Dorchester Review. A key government advisor for Alberta's new elementary school studies, social studies curriculum says people are overreacting to the discovery of what are believed to be unmarked burial sites in Kamloops, BC. Quote, almost the entire media and social media class in Canada has seized on Kamloops as evidence of Canada's Holocaust, as if the children had been deliberately killed or that death was the norm rather than the very sad exception, a Champion wrote in the Dorchester Review. He says there is a vast gulf between the fate of children buried in Kamloops and the magnitude of other atrocities. He wrote that Indigenous people should not be entitled to some unique aristocratic victim status. Last year, the Alberta government paid Champion $15,400 for 38 days of work providing advice on the kindergarten to grade 6 social studies curriculum. He previously worked for Premier Jason Kenney when Kenney was a federal Conservative cabinet minister. Champion did not respond to a request for comment. Now, okay, so Champion didn't respond to a request for comment. Is there someone else with a similar view to Champion's that this CBC reporter could have interviewed? It appears that she didn't try. She continues, parents, teachers, academics, and Indigenous leaders and elders have panned the draft curriculum as racist, Eurocentric, age inappropriate, and unsupported by research about how children best learn. Yes, as we know, children, well, white children, best learn by being demonized. The article follows recent Twitter posts by the Dorchester Review account depicting residential school students standing on a wooden structure and smiling. They were put through hell, and yet they are having an absolute blast on that play structure. What gives, reads one tweet from Wednesday. Another tweet claimed the mortality rate for children in residential school was lower than for the general population of young children in the early 1990s. Has any research been done on that? Because that would surely be relevant to the question whether there was anything disproportionate at what happened in these residential schools. But no, we're not seeing any evidence of this. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which has effectively replaced Canada's Constitution, has identified about 4,100 children who died at residential schools, but says this is likely an underestimate. Yes, of course it is, due to poor records. The commission concluded children were abused physically, emotionally, and sexually, and they died in intolerable numbers. Children at all schools have traditionally been abused physically, emotionally, and sexually, but never mind that. Nicole Sparrow, press secretary to Education Minister Adriana Lagrange, said in an email that Alberta Education denounces the Dorchester Review's tweets. The forcible removal of Indigenous children from their homes to residential schools is a dark, deplorable part of Canada's history, which is exactly why, for the first time, the new draft curriculum will teach students about residential schools, truth and reconciliation, and ensure students learn First Nations, Métis, and Inuit content in every single grade. However, the draft does not introduce the concept of residential schools until grade 5, counter to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action to start in kindergarten. So we hear from Kisha Supernant, a University of Alberta archaeology professor, someone who thinks that that's quality scholarship shouldn't be writing a curriculum because clearly they don't understand. Yes, referring to the picture of smiling children. There are many such pictures extant. Daniel Pennington, Program and Education Assistant at Toronto's Sarah and Chaim Neuberger Holocaust Education Center, says he sees parallels between the Dorchester Review tweets and the rhetoric of Holocaust deniers. The fact that the person is potentially shaping the way that Canadian children are learning about their own history is very concerning, in that he may be impeding a much-needed conversation and reckoning, he said. That sounds rather sinister. This fellow has stepped in some very troubled waters here, because it is the official view, which is set out in international protocols, that the Holocaust is a unique event in human history, and to compare it to anything else, let alone the death of 4,500 children, is diminishing of the Holocaust. It is not respectful of the Holocaust, and it is anti-Semitic. And that's exactly what this fellow, Daniel Pennington, at the Sarah and Chaim Neuberger Holocaust Education Center in Toronto has done. Opposition NDP education critic Sarah Hoffman says the tweets are further evidence the education minister should rescind the draft curriculum and rework it with Indigenous experts. Perhaps they could have a conversation, which is that one side sits and listens while the other one barks orders. Yes, she's completely misreading where Canadians, where Albertans are on this issue and how rightfully outraged we are, Hoffman said. Note, there is not a single source quoted in this story who supports Champion's point of view. And Champion is not the only person in Canada who supports this view. But the narrative has been declared, and there's no stepping away from it. This unfortunate woman, Mumalak Quack, who I talked about this week, she is not running for re-election. She is leaving the House of Commons, but she's still talking, and she will not be silenced. Well, what better venue for her talk than the House of Commons? Menaka Rabin Wilms has a story in the Globe and Mail. Mumalak Quack would give herself pep talks in the elevators at work after the doors to the parliamentary elevators closed and she could be away from her fellow MPs. She said she'd often 3 words to herself: I belong here. I belong here. There were times when others tried to tell her she didn't belong. Oh, really? She would be stopped in the hallways by security. Oh, well, as I have pointed out before, this woman's face is scarred with ritual tattoos, and she confesses to being in a highly emotional state before she entered the House of Commons. That might explain why security took an interest in her. She would be stopped in the hallways by security. People asked if she was someone's assistant. Ms. Quack Quack acknowledges she never really felt comfortable in the House of Commons. It's a very uneasy place, she said. It's a place where they make laws that result in Indigenous death and result in turmoils for a lot of our communities. I feel that. I walked into a building on fire, she said in an interview with the Globe and Mail. I ran into it with a big smile on my face, and I really had no clue what I was in for. The systems are built to work for certain people. It's middle-aged white men. Boo! It's a weird thing to realize your lack of privileges, even though you're in a position so full of privileges. Wow. What a paradox that is. Elected as an NDP MP in 2019, she said she worked too hard at the beginning, not taking 2 consecutive days off for the first several months. Since then, Ms. Quack Quack has been open about taking leaves for her own well-being on 2 occasions. Yes, she wasn't up to the job, but she wouldn't resign. That sounds like a definition of privilege to me. She's interested in the Indigenous Law program at the University of Victoria, and that she really loves beading and wants to learn more design and sewing. She also just resanded and repainted her deck, which she enjoyed. I'm kind of tempted to see if I like carpentry, she said. Although she still wants to do work that ultimately helps people, she wants to find a different way than representing them in Parliament. She feels she's done a good job as an MP, she said, but now she'd rather do something else. Chances that this woman finds a job in the private sector, 0. 0. The NGOs will look after Ms. Quack Quack, as they did before she was elected to the House of Commons. Let's go back to the chat. Is it still insanity when whole societies believe it, says Yo Mama. Yes. Yes, indeed. Indeed it is. Metal Mike says, happy Juneteenth, everyone. Canada is being cancelled by quite a few Canadian corporations. Well, I'm afraid I'm not going to be terribly put out by that because it is a generic national holiday that signifies nothing. Steve says BIPOC privilege in full force at American universities. People of color, what exactly do Chinese people, for instance, have to do with Black people in Britain or the United States or Canada? And last Confederate general to surrender was a full-blooded American Indian, says Chogokin 666. Can we get rid of MLK Day now, says Leo? No. Well, there's 2 black holidays now, and presumably there will be more. I'm kind of waiting for, if Mount Rushmore is not dynamited in its entirety, with simply Theodore Roosevelt, that horrible racist, being dynamited and replaced by George Floyd. Sorry, St. George Floyd, Doctor of Divinity. And what else do we have here? True Greenbird says we have to fight. We will not be allowed to escape. We have no promised land to escape to. We have to fight. Archaeologist who refuses to dig for evidence, says Chogokin 666. Why so little written about the Benji effect, says Don Willis. I don't know. I got a soft spot for Quack Quack, says Lou. They were all horrible racists, particularly Lincoln, says Ann Run. I have a feeling that January 6th may be on the verge of exploding in the faces of those people who have used it as a stick to beat Trump supporters and Trump voters. Breb Corleone, or at Breb Daily, wrote on Twitter, on January 5th, the night before the infamous January 6th Capitol event, this Fed was caught on camera encouraging the crowd to raid the Capitol on the next day. The crowd yells, "No, we can't do that, and he insists that everyone raids the Capitol. Who is Ray Epps? Before we get to Boomer Fed Mr. Epps, would you look at who makes an appearance? What are the odds we get a cameo from our dear friend and Fed Antifa provocateur, John Sullivan? Feds sweating on the boards tonight. Arizona, you say? Arizona man went to Washington for day of Capitol riot, appears to talk about plans in video. Oh my, Mr. Ray. Ray Epps told the Arizona Republic in a brief telephone interview Monday that he had traveled to the Capitol for the event and that he had been advised by an attorney not to speak about it. Yes, a video online appears to show him saying, "We're here to defend the Constitution. We need to go to the Capitol." Ray Epps, Boomer Fed confirmed, attending the FBI National Academy. One of the first people charging past barricades. A person who resembles Epps also appears in video of the first people charging past a line of barricades at the Capitol. An image of that man appears on an FBI news release of people being sought for information about the riot. Yeah, would you believe it? No charges have been filed against Mr. Epps. They found the Boomer Fed's Facebook. He has been running ops at the Capitol since at least the 9th month of 2012. Some of the Boomer Fed's likes are revealing, lots of rhinos and clearly a Mormon. His father is a retired Army colonel. John Miller had tweeted, "Is Ray Epps a Fed? Why hasn't this guy been indicted?" Would you look at that? Apparently was Oath Keepers Arizona chapter president. Well, as I say, this may well blow up in the faces of those who are plotting a coup, essentially to make Trumpism, whatever you want to call it, illegal, treasonable, perhaps. I want to read from an essay by a fellow who calls himself Evil Political Scientist that appeared evilps.substack.com. The United States is a totalitarian regime. Giorgio Agamben offers us a useful way to conceptualize postmodern totalitarianism. Like many brilliant concepts, such as Max Weber's ideal type of the state, it condenses so much that to grasp its insight, one needs to thoroughly unfold and expand it. I will take a roundabout approach and outline the ontology of civil war. For my friends on the left side of the bell curve, this just means what civil war is and what it is like. Using expand on Agamben's definition of totalitarian as a kind of civil war, totalitarianism as a kind of civil war. Using 1 and 2, tackle myths about totalitarianism, such as the notion that democratic totalitarianism is inherently contradictory. And with 1, 2, and 3, argue that it is perfectly reasonable to consider the United States a totalitarian regime. To start with a confession, according to Evil Political Scientist, political scientists seldom write about totalitarianism anymore. They have a dozen typologies of authoritarian regimes or autocracies or other non-democracies they purport to measure in increasingly sophisticated ways to obscure their negligible progress since the 1930s. Academics like Jason Stanley skip regimes altogether and harangue us constantly about fascism. Yet totalitarianism is a concept that has completely permeated our collective imagination. Political scientists ignore it while speaking its language. Yes, much as psychologists deride Freud while unwittingly plagiarizing him on a near daily basis. The standard retort is that totalitarianism is difficult to measure, hence unscientific. What is a civil war? Totalitarianism is a kind of civil war. What is civil war? Perhaps you picture the American Civil War, a symmetric conflict, the likes of which no longer exist, or an insurgency like those experienced in Iraq or Afghanistan. Either mental representation probably involves blood-stained battlefields as two unitary sides compete in direct fashion for victory. This conceptualization of civil war, however, is fundamentally flawed. To understand civil war, let us turn to Stathis Kalyvas's book, The Logic of Violence in Civil War. He read Mankind's collective works on civil war, not studies where an underachieving political scientist managed to chew his keyboard, but the primary sources: personal wartime accounts written by soldiers and generals, ethnographies written by anthropologists who lived in war-torn regions. Every Civil War history rich in primary sources. You have to give him credit. He's one of the few academics who actually did the job. What he found were similar patterns in the conduct of civil wars across time and space, ones that upended the traditional model of civil war. Most violence in civil wars does not take place in battle or on the front lines. In civil war, you have two sides, the state and insurgents, fighting over territory. Let us divide territory into 5 zones. Zone 1 is complete government control. Zone 3 is the contested zone, front lines, and Zone 5 is complete insurgent control. You will notice that governments kill the most within their own zone of control, and then insurgents likewise murder most in areas where they have control. Why? This does not make intuitive sense. It turns out each side murders people under its control, not only because it is easiest, but to prevent their people from defecting to the other side. They use selective violence by executing defectors, rats, informants, or double agents. In other words, they will show people under their control, look, if you cross us, we will find you and we will murder you. How do they find these victims? They receive denunciations. And here is the disheartening part, the revealing part about human nature. People will denounce each other as traitors to evil states or insurgents for petty reasons, to settle a score, to punish a rival, to gain an advantage in love or career, to discard of a no longer needed friend or relative. Neither states nor insurgents care whether the accusation is true, so long as witnesses perceive that speaking out will result in death. How is totalitarianism a civil war? It's a one-sided civil war where one side has absolute control over the territory it claims. We might think the imposition of state power, Leviathan, brings peace, but recall that in civil war, a state commits most of its violence in areas it controls. Now that's the whole country. Congratulations, peace at last. States like power, so why should they tolerate defectors or traitors? After all, they can impose a great or else over their subjects by punishing perceived traitors, and it turns out that people are quite willing to denounce their friends and neighbors to a totalitarian state when it serves their interests. Kalavas gives the example of Pavlik Morozov, who denounced his father to the Soviet Union for strictly personal reasons, a fact the Soviets ignored because they could hold Pavlik up as an exemplary Soviet who put state before family. Modern research, as they say, suggests that the entire legend of Pavel or Pavlik Morozov is made up in order to terrify people with the prospect that you are not safe. Nowhere are you safe, not even the bosom of your family, because your children are watching. They're spying on you, looking for evidence of ideological deviation. We see this everywhere in totalitarian regimes. In Nazi Germany, spouses were the largest source of denunciation to the regime. Or take the Cultural Revolution, where people were free to murder their neighbors to steal their land, so long as the Chinese Communist Party could claim the victims were class enemies. It was not the state or the Red Guards who carried out the atrocities in this case, so much as embittered associates, all under a state ideology that legitimated their perversities. Totalitarianism operates according to the same logic as civil war. A state, now with absolute control, wants to root out traitors to feed its inherently expansionist nature and associated need to demonstrate power. With a legitimizing cover, many people are more than happy to denounce their competitors to the state, or when given tacit approval, to eliminate their rivals themselves. Agamben is correct to describe this as legal in the sense that the state sanctions civil war against its enemies. Does totalitarianism necessarily conflict with democracy, or is it simply that they tend not to occur together? Scholars of civil war observe that internal wars are rare in democracies, but they certainly do not claim civil wars cannot happen in democracies. Totalitarianism is a form of civil war. I presume you can connect the dots, unless you are a political scientist. Well, democracy means, at its root, power, kratos, a rather brutal sense of the people. Democracy does not require elections, not at all. If the people can be found, or 50% plus one can be found to prefer a certain course of action, then that action, up to including suppression of freedoms, mass murder even, can be claimed to be democratic. Oh, is the voice of the people the voice of God? No, it is not. And this is the mistake that so many people make. The rulers of the United States now, and the rulers of Canada for that matter, Justin Trudeau's government, are making the argument that people who are not sufficiently woke, such as people who do not buy the residential schools myth, are enemies of the people. And we know what happens to enemies of the people. They get it in the neck. And our essayist, Evil Political Science, concludes, I'm not saying that the United States is an absolute incorrigible totalitarian regime. I am merely providing a framework for understanding the current political situation, since so few are to be found. It is not true or false, but useful or useless, which is a conclusion each must reach for himself. And again, you can find this essay at evilps.substack.com. The United States is a totalitarian regime. A famous English historian once noted with some admiration or shock or bemusement that until 1914, the beginning of World War I, or the Great War as they called it on the time, for most Englishmen, their sole connection with the government was the village postman. Now the government intervenes in every single aspect of our lives, often aggressively, claiming always, of course, that it is for our own good. So could it be that the COVID-19 epidemic was, in fact, all things considered, a good thing? Is there a silver lining to this pandemic? Could we think of it in terms of creative destruction? Well, that clown David Brooks thinks so. And here he is in the New York Times. The American Renaissance has begun. And he explains the rapid economic growth of West Germany and Japan after World War II. And why? Well, because essentially they were leveled. The old arrangements had been disrupted. The devastation itself and the forces of American occupation and reconstruction dislodged the interest groups that had held back innovation. Oh, I see. Germany was not innovative until after 1945? Does David Brooks seriously believe that? The old patterns that stifled experimentation were swept away. The disruption opened space for something new. Something similar may be happening today. COVID-19 has disrupted daily American life in a way few emergencies have had before, but it has also shaken things up and cleared the way for an economic boom and social revival. Disruption. Ooh, sounds very Silicon Valley, doesn't it? Millions of Americans endured grievous loss and anxiety during this pandemic, but many also used the time as a preparation period so they could burst out of the gate when things opened up. After decades of slowing entrepreneurial dynamism, 4.4 million new businesses were started in 2020, by far a modern record. A report from Udemy, an online course provider, says that 38% of workers took some additional training during 2020, up from only 14% in 2019. After decades in which consumption took preference over savings, Americans socked away trillions of dollars in 2020, reducing their debt burdens to lows not seen since 1980, and putting themselves in a position to spend lavishly as things open up. I like that. Americans socked away trillions of dollars in 2020. Did your neighbor, the one who owned a business that was deemed non-essential during the panic and was shut down and is now out of business, and he's bankrupt now. Did he sock away? Was he part of the class that socked away trillions of dollars in 2020? We know who socked away trillions of dollars in 2020. The 1% did. Now, Fool Brooks continues, the biggest shifts, though, may be mental. People have been reminded that life is short. For over a year, many experienced daily routines that were slower paced, more rooted, more domestic. Millions of Americans seem ready to change their lives to be more in touch with their values. Values is an infinitely mutable term that today means nothing. We've been reminded that life is short. No, we've been reminded that death is intolerable, even for people in their 80s. That's what we have been reminded. We have been told that every other single person on earth is a deadly threat to us. And in fact, the great outdoors are a threat to us because there's all that air that might have COVID in it. Well, of course, it doesn't, but you got to wear a mask because one can't be too careful. And one death is too many. There was a long trend before COVID of people isolating themselves, and the internet made that faster. And with COVID, why do you ever have to leave the house? Everything one needs can be got from Amazon or DoorDash or whatever. People are dangerous. Brooks, I don't know, is he disingenuous or just stupid? The economy has already taken off. Global economic growth is expected to be north of 6% this year. Yes, when governments are spending literally trillions of dollars for people not to work, you see, government output, government spending counts as part of the GDP. The government, if the government decided to, the U.S. government, for instance, decided to spend twice as much on COVID and so-called COVID relief, well, that would increase the GDP that much more. It's not sustainable growth. Let's see. Oh, power has been shifting from employers to workers. Well, you see, there has been a temporary shift. The workers aren't getting that much more money. And a large part of that has to do with Trump shutting down the border. Or, the border was effectively shut down compared to how it had been in previous years. But Biden has opened up the doors again. And hey, let's have all these people from Central America just wander across, claiming to be refugees. Many of them don't even speak Spanish. They have low IQs and low skills. That's gonna put that rising wage problem in place. He says there seems to be a rebalancing between cities and suburbs, about rebalancing between work and domestic life. Stanford economist Nicholas Bloom expects that even when the pandemic is over, the number of working days spent at home will increase to 20% from 5% in the pre-pandemic era. We'll see there's a problem with this. It has been observed for quite some time. Miss Manners was one of the first, that the dividing line between work and home has effectively been erased. People do personal things, take care of personal business when they are at work or in the office. And on the other hand, the office intrudes on your personal life. There are many people doomed to jobs where their boss or customers can get a hold of them at almost any time of the day. When people are working at home and they are putting off doing work to look at YouTube videos or whatever, or to check their emails or to send texts, very unpleasantly in many cases, they find that their workday doesn't end at 5 o'clock. It ends at 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10, and perhaps never ends. Brooks writes, well, this has increased pressures on many women. Millions of Americans who could work remotely found that they like being home, dining every night with their kids, not hassling with the commute. We are apparently becoming a less work-obsessed and a more domestic society. Ho, ho. Very satirical. People are shifting their personal lives to address common problems. No, they're not. The exact opposite is happening. Loneliness and loss of community. Oh, yes. Instead of, staring at a screen at the office, we will just be staring at screens at home or when we're on the street or when we're in our car. There's no escape from the screens. This does not cure loneliness or build community. Again, I suppose David Brooks has discovered the key. He's cracked the code to becoming a universally revered pundit, which is that he is entirely fatuous. Let's have a rather dissenting view from Brooks, from James Kunstler. He writes in his column today, "Free at last. For now, the public seems to want nothing more than to breathe a little easier, that is, without masks on our faces after a year of COVID-19 paranoia, and attempt to return to something like normal life. It's like an all-clear siren went off the past week, and a consensus swept the land that can be summed up as we're done with that. There were 0 cases of COVID-19 in my upstate New York County the past week, and now the few people going around still masked begin to look a little like whack jobs acting out a stupid morality play." The official COVID-19 narrative took quite a beating last month, but the bottom line of it all is hardly reassuring. The main theme of the narrative was the insistence by public health authorities at the highest level, staunchly supported by the compliant news media, that the disease did not originate in the Wuhan, China virology lab. They kept the story going all year. Then, just days ago, the narrative flipped and is suddenly accepted as self-evident. Of course the virus came out of the Wuhan lab. Jon Stewart shouted this right out in Stephen Colbert's contorted face on TV. Dr. Fauci's email trail says as much, along with videos of his colleague, Peter Daszak, bragging on it as far back as 2012, with plenty of supporting evidence from various Chinese scientists. But the flip-flop on Wuhan, Kunstler continues, leaves some extremely uncomfortable questions that the nation is too distracted or dishonest to debate in the public forum these days being mostly social media, Twitter and Facebook. And it's not altogether clear whether they will continue to suppress discussion about the origin of the virus and issues arising out of that, though they risk looking tyrannically obtuse if they keep up the gaslighting. And in these sorry years of anything goes and nothing matters, Zook and Jack may never have to answer for their craven deeds. The biggest question that the authorities want to evade is, if the virus did originate from the Wuhan lab, was it released by accident or on purpose? The Joe Biden government is now forced to at least pretend that it will investigate. My guess is they don't want to know. And he talks about perhaps China acting, using this to reduce the USA to a vassal nation that can only supply China with food, oil, and other resources. The infrastructure of the service economy got gutted during the lockdowns, Kunstler continues. Millions of businesses bankrupted, restaurants, yoga studios, concert venues, dog groomers, shops of all kinds, you name it, gone. And a lot of the people who took livelihoods from that are financially ruined for good. What's left? Healthcare and pharma, 2 odious rackets preying on the psychological weaknesses of people so beaten down by adversity that they can only console themselves with junk food, liquor, sexual debauchery, and drugs, and then must beg the healthcare service to fix them, after which it squashes them to death with outlandish charges for services rendered. Or government, another reprehensible racket, seeking desperately now to control its citizens' every move, while everything it does is not only running wildly out of control, but via the most idiotic suicidal policies, such as throwing the border with Mexico wide open to all comers, while it pays Americans not to work. For now, all these mighty issues stand aside while Americans enjoy some early summer days of liberation from a long nightmare. Coincidentally, the Democratic Party has now just engineered 2 separate but equal Independence Days for America, Juneteenth for people of color, and the familiar old 4th of July for everybody else. Isn't that a fine way to reinforce the idea that we are so irreconcilably far apart? A thought just occurred to me. You have heard Joe Biden state many times that if Americans are good little boys and girls, he may let them celebrate the glorious 4th. Have you heard any such warnings about Juneteenth? Could it be possible we'll have a situation where, have a barbecue, have, 20, 30, 40, 50 people over at your barbecue for Juneteenth, but the rest of you on July the 4th, I'm afraid the counts aren't down enough, or the R number is not doing what it's supposed to. So no, I'm not going to allow you to celebrate Independence Day in the traditional fashion. I don't know. Could happen. And okay, more COVID news. Now, this is a very interesting story from the Times of Israel. I don't think I will be punished for talking about this. Hospitalized COVID-19 patients are far more likely to die or end up in severe or critical condition if they are vitamin D deficient, Israeli researchers have found. In a study conducted in a Galilee hospital, 26% of vitamin D deficient coronavirus patients died, while among other patients, the figure was 3%. This is a very, very significant discrepancy, which represents a big clue that starting the disease with very low vitamin D leads to increased mortality and more severity. Dr. Amir Bashkin, endocrinologist and part of the research team, told the Times of Israel. For much of the pandemic, many scientists have suggested that the so-called sunshine vitamin may help people fight the disease. The new study represents one of the most compelling pieces of supporting research yet. Dr. Emil Dror, who led the research, said, in short, after conducting this study, I would say to people that during this pandemic, you certainly want to make sure that you have adequate vitamin D, because if you contract the coronavirus, it will help you. And, okay, so masks, efficacious or not? But even assuming that masks work, that they do what they're supposed to do, what about contraindications? Well, here's a story from Citizen Free Press. A group of parents sent their kids' masks to a lab for analysis. A group of parents in Gainesville, Florida, concerned about potential harms from masks, submitted 6 face masks to a lab for analysis. The resulting report found that 5 masks were contaminated with bacteria, parasites, and fungi, including 3 with dangerous pathogenic and pneumonia-causing bacteria. No viruses were detected on the masks, although the test is capable of detecting viruses. And then there's a long list of dangerous bacteria, including that which causes pneumonia, tuberculosis, meningitis, keratitis, bloodstream infections, food poisoning, Lyme disease, diphtheria, Legionnaire's disease. Yeah, how about that? I mean, it stands to reason if there had ever been a serious mask regime, it wouldn't be cloth coverings like the one I wear unwillingly. These would be, N95 masks, I believe they're called, and we would be required to discard them at regular intervals, perhaps, one use only. You go to the store, you wear the mask, you come back, you throw it away. You go out somewhere else, well, you need a new mask. But no, that was never done and not really ever considered. Here's a story from John Nolte at Breitbart. By way of a unforgivable but very revealing act of silence, several scientists now admit to having misled the country for more than a year by covering up their belief that the coronavirus lab leak theory is valid enough to warrant investigation. In other words, here's one more reason to never again trust the scientific community. What we have here is an astonishing admission and one more reason not to believe the so-called scientific consensus about anything, most especially life-altering issues such as global warming or climate change or whatever these charlatans call it today. Think about it. If a herd of scientists is willing to lie through an act of omission about the lab leak, imagine the other lies they're telling us or are allowing to be told when it comes to everything else. NBC reports Alina Chan was one of 18 scientists who published a letter in the journal Science last month, calling for a more in-depth investigation of the virus's origin that takes into account theories about both natural occurrence and laboratory spillovers. The letter helped kickstart a new round of calls to investigate the lab leak hypothesis, including demands from President Biden and several leading scientists. Chan said that there had been trepidation among some scientists about publicly discussing the lab leak hypothesis for fear that their words could be misconstrued or used to support racist rhetoric about how the coronavirus emerged. Trump-fueled accusations that the Wuhan Institute of Virology, a research lab in the city where the first COVID-19 cases were reported, was connected to the outbreak, and on numerous occasions he called the pathogen the Wuhan virus or Kung flu. Quote, Dr. Chan, at the time, it was scarier to be associated with Trump and to become a tool for the racists. So people didn't want to publicly call for an investigation into lab origins. This is what they call the noble lie. Scientists, however, are not supposed to indulge in the noble lie. But of course they do. Of course they do. Here's a story from the Associated Press. Many Americans are relaxing precautions taken during the COVID-19 pandemic and resuming everyday activities. Yay! Yay? Even as some worry that coronavirus-related restrictions were hastily lifted, a new poll shows. The poll from APNORC, Center for Public Affairs Research, finds that majorities of Americans who were regularly doing so before the pandemic say they are returning to bars or restaurants, traveling and attending events such as movies or sports. Just 21% are very or extremely worried about a COVID-19 infection in their inner circle, the lowest level since the pandemic began, and only 25% are highly concerned that the lifted restrictions will lead to additional people being infected in their community. You're not scared enough. You're not terrified enough. What is wrong with you people? Masks forever. This is from Kerry Goldberg at Bloomberg. COVID counts hit 0 in U.S. hospitals once overrun by victims. Well, that's good news, except there is a lie embedded in that headline because hospitals were never overrun by victims. In fact, Trump secured an ocean liner for New York City. Never used. It was never used. There were lots of hospitals last spring and summer which were essentially empty. Well, one reason being is that COVID is the only disease that counts, and if you don't have it, stay away. You know, die of a heart disease, die of a heart attack, die of a stroke, die of cancer. We don't care because we only care about COVID. Here's a story from livemint.com. UK virus cases surge, even as 8 in 10 have received shots. I don't know that I would want to draw any conclusions from that because it might get me into trouble with the host of this live stream. It's a story from Reuters. No, not a story, a fact check from Reuters. Claims that British Airways is in crisis talks with the British government due to the deaths of 3 pilots who received COVID-19 shots are unfounded. A company representative and British medicines regulator spokesperson has told Reuters. Shared in the form of a voice recording on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, an unidentified male says he has spoken to a friend who's a BA pilot and explains things are getting crazy after 3 fellow pilots passed away. Well, okay. If this were true, would British Airways admit it? I think that's the question one has to ask. Here's a story for John Jackson of Newsweek. During a television appearance on Sunday night, Dr. Marty Makary of Johns Hopkins Hospital claimed that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention sits on a lot of data. He also suggested the reason why the health organization holds back information is to better support their agenda, along with being a health policy expert. The mistake is Newsweek's, not mine. And Surgeon Macari is a Fox News contributor. It was on that network where he made the comments regarding the CDC not being forthcoming about its information. The claim came during the Sunday edition of the program, The Next Revolution, with Steve Hilton. While discussing the effects of COVID-19 on youth, Macari said the headlines that were not broadcast by the CDC and the media did not cover was that no child in that entire study died of COVID, number one. And number two, the hospitalization rate was lower for COVID than it was for influenza. The CDC sits on a lot of data. And let's take a look at lockdown skeptics. America is open, so why aren't we? We being, England and Wales? Good question. The European Union fails in court ruling to secure 120 million doses of AstraZeneca vaccine, but Bloc still claims victory. NHS doctor says Matt Hancock is not fit for public office and needs to be removed before he inflicts further harm on the people of this country. This would be NHS GP Dr. Helen Westwood, a member of the Heart group. She has written a letter to her MP, Sir Graham Brady, expressing her concerns about the possible government plans for mandatory vaccination of healthcare workers and others. Those who have had AstraZeneca vaccine or no vaccine at all banned from upcoming Bruce Springsteen show. What's the problem with the AstraZeneca vaccine? I thought they were all equally good. Age standardized mortality rate falls to lowest level on record again. Government might exempt 2,500 football officials from travel quarantine rules so that Euro finals can take place at Wembley Stadium. No mandatory vaccination for care home staff in Wales. COVID vaccination open to all over 18s in England. And let's take a look at Alex Berenson's Twitter feed. Okay. But CDC, the CDC says that the cases are mild, right? And CDC never lies. How about life-threatening cases? VAERS has a total of 42 life-threatening myopericarditis case reports for non-COVID shots, 1.4 a year. What about COVID shots? 98 life-threatening reports, 98 in 6 months. It's not just myocarditis, and it's not just in teens and 20-somethings. Yes, the book review of Abigail Schreier's book at Science Based Med has been retracted. Portraying this retraction as censorship are also false. This has nothing to do with silencing opinions or perspectives, but rather is entirely a matter of quality control. Yes. And Mark Hemingway responds, it was absolutely censorship, and anyone saying otherwise is delusional or gaslighting. Berenson comments, LOL, Science-Based Med, edited by G. Orkson, removes a review of Abigail Schreier's book on transgenderism months after posting it, and then huffs, this has nothing to do with silencing opinions. No, they just thought it needed a different font. Okay. Let's go back to the chat. Steve says, U.S. suspended a military aid package to Ukraine right after the meeting with Putin. Isn't the first one offered the best one, says Dan? That's what we have been told about vaccines over and over again. Neil Terry says New York City's hospitals never got above 25% full. Such a scam. They had to kill nursing home patients just to scare people. Burkan Sultanov says drawing conclusions might lead to concussions. That's a good one. That's a good one. Putin recognizes a puppet when he sees one, says Steve. Okay. The man is a decrepit, bumbling puppet. Again from Steve. Tricky Who says, look at the size of the radioactive plumes that blew over the Earth from Fukushima. Neil Terry again, I'm not a big fan of African dictators, but the one who sent fruit samples for COVID testing was a genius. Of course, he's dead now, had a surprise heart attack. Dan, face diapers, yes, or face nappies, as they call them in England. Berkin Sultanov says hypoxia, bad breath, recycling, sulfur. Oh, yes, David Brooks. Savage says diversity is perversity, says half a Galician. Berkin Sultanov says, why does liberal democracy produce such flabby, mediocre ruling class? Because horses for courses, as they say in England. Neil Terry says, I use every resource I can to do my work at my job. My employers don't have my home number. Well, lucky you. I mean that sincerely. I used to be a talk radio producer, and the number of calls and emails from my boss during the day, and then any time was when I was at home. I was working 70 hours a week or more, and I took Friday off, and I'd get hammered, and he would call me at 8:30, 9 o'clock on Saturday morning. And, yeah, hello, what? Oh, Peter, yeah, what do you want? And he's like, come on, snap to it. And I just knew, if everyone had cell phones, then I would not have got a moment's peace. I probably would have strangled him or attempted to. Steve says, wait, binge watching TV while getting checks from the government isn't a sustainable economic model. Anren says, to repeat an anecdote, Taki claims to have perhaps saved David Brooks's life at a busy intersection and then regretted it when he saw who it was he had saved. What's the name of the actor, the Canadian actor who saved the famous feminist Penny Red? And then Laurie Penny, and then she was just bloody about this afterwards. Oh, everyone's always asking me about the time that famous hunky Hollywood actor saved me from being knocked over and killed by a taxi. Won't they just shut up about it? Normal people would have been absolutely thrilled, not only that their life had probably been saved by a stranger, but that it was a famous hunky Hollywood actor who had done it. Let me just give me a minute. Bear with me for a moment. Laurie Penny, is of course an entirely objectionable person, but who was it who saved her life? Can I find this here on Wikipedia, or has this been removed? Because yes, it has probably been removed because it is too embarrassing to Laurie Penny. I don't know why it would be considered embarrassing. I suppose, people get tired of telling the same story again. But in this case, Ryan Gosling. Yes. It was Ryan Gosling. How about that? Very talented actor, I must say. And back to the chat. I blame boomers who didn't have internet. No, I'm not going to repeat that. Brandon Smith says it's interesting watching how well-trained people have become. Well, yes. Here's something that is health-related. It is from UPI.com. UPI, does that still exist? This is by Brian Dunleavy. Too many ultra-processed foods in childhood linked to extra weight gain as adult. Children as young as 7 who consume large amounts of ultra-processed foods experience steady weight gain into adulthood, a study published Monday by the Journal of the American Medical Association Pediatrics found. People whose daily diets are about 70% ultra-processed, which tend to be high-calorie and include a range of artificial ingredients, saw an average weight gain of about half a pound a year over a 10-year period, the data showed. The weight gain caused many of them to meet the criteria for obesity or being severely overweight and place them at increased risk for diabetes and heart disease, among other heart problems. Of particular concern is the growing consumption of these foods among children and adolescents who are leading consumers. The findings are based on an analysis of the diet and health status for more than 9,000 children in Britain. Ultra-processed foods are made primarily from substances extracted from foods, such as fats, starches, and sugars. These food products, such as frozen meals, soft drinks, fast food, candy, and salty snacks, may also contain additives, including artificial colors and flavors, the school says. Well, as far as children goes, it might still be possible for their parents to insist that they eat proper meals at certain defined times of the day instead of essentially snacking all throughout the day. Well, you can't stop them from, drinking Coke and eating Cheetos all day. Well, I suppose if you don't give them the money for that, then they can't do it. I know it sounds revolutionary. I took a particular personal interest in this, of course, because since I have been living in a hotel since December of last year, this is exactly the food that I am subsisting on. And yes, I have gained weight, a significant amount of weight. I mean, there's a microwave here, and there's a mini fridge, and I suppose, I can buy a sandwich made at Save On Foods, which has, bread and cheese and roast beef in it and some lettuce. I guess that is not highly processed food. Maybe I should switch to an entirely roast beef sandwich diet. I'm sure it would be much better for me than these microwaved things that I cook up a couple of times a day. Briefly, I'm going to talk about another New York Times story. The New York Times is just a cornucopia. It's just so great. It's just, you understand that everything in the New York Times is wrong for one reason or another. So it's perfect fodder for this show. This is by Elizabeth Diaz. The Roman Catholic bishops of the United States, flouting a warning from the Vatican, have overwhelmingly voted to draft a statement on the sacrament of the Eucharist, advancing a political push by conservative bishops to deny President Biden communion because of his support of abortion rights. The decision, made public Friday afternoon, is aimed at the nation's second Catholic president, the most religiously observant commander-in-chief since Jimmy Carter, and exposes bitter divisions in American Catholicism. The measure was approved by a vote of 73% in favor, 24% opposed. The Eucharist, also called Holy Communion, is one of the most sacred rituals in Christianity. The Eucharist is not the ritual. The Mass is the ritual. Does the religion reporter for the New York Times doesn't understand that much? And bishops have grown worried in recent years about declining Mass attendance and misunderstanding of the importance of the sacrament to Catholic life. But the move to target a president who has regularly attended Mass throughout his life is striking, coming from leaders of the president's own faith, particularly after many conservative Catholics turned a blind eye to the sexual improprieties of former President Donald Trump because they supported his political agenda. It reveals a uniquely American Catholicism increasingly at odds with Rome. Fun fact about President Donald Trump: he's not Catholic. So the Catholic Church is not in any position to regulate his behavior or to call him out for things he has said or done, which would prevent him from receiving the Eucharist. I hope that Elizabeth Diaz in the New York Times understands that much. But the fact that Biden's views on abortions are even a matter of public discussion, can you imagine that? Is already a victory for conservative Catholics. Biden, like Pope Francis, embodies a liberal Christianity, focused less on sexual politics and more on racial inequality, climate change, and poverty. His administration is a reversal of the power that abortion opponents, including bishops who advanced the measure, enjoyed under Trump. Yeah, okay. I could point out that Joe Biden also married 2 men in the vice president's residence. Yes, he married 2 men. He's not a priest, you understand, and marriage between members of the same sex is not permitted in the Catholic religion, but that is not mentioned in this story. Okay, it is 5:30, and I'm going to go to the book club. And just give me a second here. Well, I open up a bunch of tabs. The book is by a man called Stanley Bing. His name was not actually Stanley Bing. That was a nom de plume. The book is called Immortal Life, a soon-to-be true story, which was published by Simon & Schuster in 2017. And I have to say, right from the outset, I found this book thrilling and delightful and tremendously thought-provoking. One is, I said delighted, because one had come to the conclusion that it was not possible for books like this to be written anymore. But here we go. Stanley Bing was actually a man called Gil Schwartz, and he was very successful in business. According to Wikipedia, he was Senior Executive Vice President of Corporate Communications and Chief Communications Officer for CBS. And despite his success in business, he wrote an awful lot of books, many of which seem interesting or amusing. Bizwords, Power Talk for Fun and Profit, Crazy Bosses, Spotting Them, Serving Them, Surviving Them, What Would Machiavelli Do? Throwing the Elephant, Zen and the Art of Managing Up, The Big Bing, Black Holes of Time Management, Gaseous Executive Bodies, Exploding Careers, and Other Theories on the Origins of the Business Universe. Sun Tzu was a sissy, Conquer Your Enemies, Promote Your Friends, and Wage the Real Art of War. Rome Incorporated, The Rise and Fall of the First Multinational Corporation. This is my favorite title, 100 Bullshit Jobs and How to Get Them. Executrix, How to Retire While You're Still Working, Bing Sop's Fables, Little Morals for Big Business, and the curriculum, Everything You Need to Know to Be a Master of Business Arts. And he wrote 3 novels in addition to that. Immortal Life, well, it gives you an idea of the subject of the book. Schwartz himself died last year at the age of 68. I was looking at the reviews of this book, and I noticed that a great many of the reviewers, particularly some guy who calls himself Cambridge Geek, they were not happy with this book. Why were they not happy with this book? Because apparently Stanley Bing, or Gil Schwartz, saw this rather as a comedy, the whole attempt to live forever. Oh, and apparently, the science is wrong. Well, given that, Bing is talking about things which are impossible now, which become possible in the future, I don't know how it would be possible for the science to be wrong. In any event, in questions, in matters of this sort, it doesn't matter whether the science is made up. It only matters as if it sounds realistic. One thing that struck me very strongly reading this book is this where is the quest for immortality going to lead to? It's going to lead to vampirism, which we see in this book. That let's look at recent decades. Let's look at how science has changed our lives. Well, we give Ritalin to boys, and Adderall to boys, and people who are not behaving properly are given antidepressants or antipsychotics. Effectively, their brains are scooped out and replaced with cotton wool. As everyone knows, as men grow older, their interest in sexual congress and or their ability to engage in it decreases. Well, now we have pills for that. We've had pills for 25 years for that. But amusingly, of course, Viagra and Cialis quickly became recreational drugs. To answer the question, how many orgasms can a man have over the course of a dirty weekend? Well, pregnancy is fraught with all manner of difficulties. So how are we dealing with that? Well, one problem is that homosexuals cannot have children. That is to say, a man cannot mate with a man and a woman cannot mate with a woman. So we have all these celebrity homosexuals, and they have white children. Where did these white children come from? They were bought, weren't they? They were bought from poor people. And let's look at these famous women who have children. Megan Mertz would be one example. Is it really her child? I mean, is she the natural mother of this child? But increasingly, rich women are deciding to farm out pregnancy to poor women. These women get paid to gestate babies. And in some cases, as I say, the supposed father and mother have no biological connection to the baby at all. It's a new form of sexual slavery, which is just a couple of decades old. Let's look at COVID-19. These so-called mRNA vaccines, they are not vaccines, not as we have understood vaccines. They are experimental gene therapy utilizing nanotechnology. And the boffins behind mRNA technology believe that it can be employed essentially to defeat all diseases, leading to people living forever. Well, it was suggested to me some years ago that it is encoded into our DNA that every other thing being equal, we can't live past 100. The body just falls apart. Now, there are people over the age of 100 who are alive today, but these people are outliers. They are freaks. But let's start with the novel and the dedication, which is, clearly ironic. But if it weren't for them, we wouldn't have this novel. To Craig Venter, Larry Ellison, Sergey Brin, and Larry Page, Mark Zuckerberg, Mark Andreessen, Elon Musk, and all the visionary titans of tech now exploring the possibility of eternal life for those who can afford it. Oh, I forgot in my list, Blood Boys. I learned about this from the HBO Silicon Valley show, that tech titans hire healthy young men who must restrict themselves to a very narrow, healthy diet and not use drugs or alcohol. They give up their blood to the tech titans, and they're called Blood Boys. And this is happening already. Let's see some quotations from the beginning. When you talk to a human in 2035, you'll be talking to someone that's a combination of biological and non-biological intelligence. That is from Ray Kurzweil. Nick Bostrom of Oxford University says, if emulation of particular brains is possible and affordable, and if concerns about individual identity can be met, such emulation would enable backup copies and so-called digital immortality. And a joke from Woody Allen, I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve it not through not dying. Do people really want to live together? There is so much in this book that resembles things that I've been thinking for several decades. For instance, this question of people living to 150, which apparently we're just on the verge of now, and which this book starts with. That's the premise Immortal Life starts with. You make it to 150, or you make it 120, 130, 140, then what? Well, one of the things I predicted is, if this becomes possible, or it becomes the norm, people are going to be absolutely terrified of death in a way that they have not been done so before. By that, I mean accidental death. People die from falling downstairs, from tripping in the shower, from, tripping over a wire like that one and smashing their head against something. People die in automobile accidents. Pedestrians get run over. And in Athena, which is the new headquarters of the clever clogs, the technological boffins, well, the transportation has been limited. Ground transportation has been limited to 15 miles an hour, because any speed higher than that, well, would raise the possibility of accidental death. And you can imagine someone, let's say he falls down the stairs or he smacks his head against a coffee table, and in, those final moments before he bleeds out, he's thinking, this is just so stupid. I'm only 84 years old. I could have had another 60 years. The novel begins with a man, a very, very nasty man called Arthur Vogel. And if you want to take Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and a bunch of these people and just sort of put them together, Zuckerberg, of course, and put the nastiest possible spin, you'd end up with Arthur Vogel. I'll read it from the beginning. The room was kept dark on purpose, a soft pin spot here and there, because at the age of 127, the creature that had once been Arthur Vogel couldn't stand bright light. It hurt his eyes, his skin, the tiny blisters that had formed at the top of his skull. Also, he couldn't tolerate being seen clearly by anyone but Sally, not even by himself. Hence, in the absence of mirrors, the prescription against implements that had the capacity to record video. A while back, at the age of 103 or so, Arthur had retired from public view almost entirely. There he nestled on his vast estate in the pastoral heart of the urban sprawl that stretched from Santa Barbara to San Diego. By day, on his vast outside patio, soaking in the vitamin D that he believed would keep him alive forever. After sunset, retreating to his private study to feed the lizards, toads, and spiders that inhabited his massive assemblage of terrariums. And throughout, at all hours, constantly, incessantly doing business through the wireless communication implant that ran beneath the wafer-thin layer of his skull. Yet as powerful a digital presence as he still might be, he had for some time not actually been seen by human or inhuman eyes. He who had once been the most visible mogul in his coterie of behemoths, the center of a prodigious entourage whose dissolute hijinks had become the stuff of legend, the subject of more ridiculous scandal than Emperor Tiberius in his prime, orgies, bottomless onslaughts of willing, wily gold diggers, more ex-wives than the Sultan of Brunei, yachts, private islands steeped in unpardonable sins, and now nothing. This absence led to some speculation about his whereabouts, his health overall, and his ability to manage the enormous empire that was currently valued at $63.1 trillion in global operations alone. And that didn't count the growing hydroponic farm now being built under the surface of the planet of Musk, formerly known as Mars, where he had been first to strike water in 2034. Arthur is he's half man, half machine. Or the older he gets, the more machine. He's more machine than man, because he is not really capable of living anymore. That his physical body says, okay, you've made it up this far, but we can't go any farther. So Arthur is a boomer. And this is important because he has all of the, I don't know, how would you say, the ambition, all of the negativities of the boomer, not least of which, break on through to the other side, still shouting that at 70 or 80 or 127, and I'm going to live forever, right? And despite his hideousness, he is gifted with a woman, an exceedingly attractive woman called Sally, who is genuinely quite fond of him. She actually loves him for some reason or another, and is willing to have sex with him. And it goes like this. Go ahead, he said, print one out. Okay. Sally patted the top of his mottled, shiny head. You are one horn dog, she added, moving over to the dresser where she addressed a small printer that rested unobtrusively next to a houseplant. She made sure the readouts were appropriate, and then she pressed a button and went into the bathroom, turned on the shower, a bit of humming. Arthur lay back on the bed, his hands behind his head. Profits were good. His businesses enjoyed a 78% market share in every single space in which they operated. That was not particularly unusual. Amazon and its subsidiaries controlled 87% of all online retail. The global conglomerate that was once Facebook now held a 92% market share of all online advertising. He listened to the sound of Sally in the shower. Gonna get laid soon, he thought. That's one thing that never gets old. Sally came in, still wearing her flowing caftan. Ah, here we go, she said. She gently removed the brand new penis from the 3D printer and placed it on the little plate of bone white china that rested on the night table by the side of his bed. Now I'll leave you for a minute, she said demurely, and once again went into the bathroom, the sound of running water coming from the sink. On the way out, she had dimmed the lights. It was nice in the room. The shades were closed, but the sunlight was streaming in. It was still early. Lots of time for all the great things you could do in a day if you weren't dead. Arthur looked at the freshly created penis. It was a decent size, but not ridiculous. Quite attractive, actually. Much nicer than what had become of his original when he considered it. She came back in just a few minutes later without the caftan. You ready? She said, smiling. Baby, said Arthur, snapping the new appendage into place with a soft and reassuring click. I'm always ready. Arthur went to Woodstock, and he went to Altamont, and he liked to smoke dope, and he liked to get high on cigars and tequila and roar down California highways at 120 miles an hour. You see, Arthur's problem is that despite the fact that he's still alive, he's got to the point where, is it worth it? Yeah, sure, life is great. Marshall McLuhan famously said, consider the alternative. But there comes a point where it seems to be more torture than anything else. What's keeping Arthur alive? Well, not to give too much away, but Arthur wants to control. He wants to be the dictator of the solar system. When this is put to him, he replies, not the universe. Arthur likes to think big. We are next introduced to a man called Gene. And Gene, we learn that Gene seems to be senile. He has bits of information floating around, and people say things to him, and he recognizes words or phrases or people's names, but he doesn't really know what they mean. And then we learn that Gene is an artificial creation, and he has been created as nothing less than a vessel for Arthur. Arthur needs a new vessel. Gene is not too keen on this idea. Particularly, he has developed a kind of primitive sentience or consciousness, and he doesn't want to surrender it. Also, he comes to learn that the actual process of the transferal is excruciatingly painful. But as they say, you can't make an omelet or, eternal life without breaking a few eggs or busting a few skulls. It's vague about this United States of America in the near future. Bad things have happened. Many bad things. Let's see. I'll describe it. There's a civil war going on. It seems to be eternal. So while they ate, they grazed through every bit of news that Livia's personal algorithm had selected as being of interest to her. Much of it seemed to aggravate her. It certainly unsettled him. It said that the Civil War was supposedly winding down. It was always winding down, but it never wound down completely because no matter how many of the other guys you killed, there were always more to go around. There was still something blue on both coasts, plus a narrow band that included Chicago, a small island off the eastern coast of what used to be Florida before the rest of it was submerged, and a blob around Austin, Texas. There were also large swaths of green in various sectors of the map here and there, the significance of which Gene did not understand. The real American Republic now reportedly included the entire South, most of Wyoming, Idaho, and everything of the Pacific Northwest but Seattle and Portland. Colorado still stood, but the reporter wondered for how long. The rest of what was formerly the United States was currently up for grabs, with very little power behind the forces that wanted to keep it together. This book was published in 2017, and it very cleverly anticipates the split, the tremendous split, the binary division between Trump's America and Hillary's America, or Biden's America. Also, as we've seen, we see later, we see that Trump's America is also weird America, homestead America, DIY America. And there's a lot in that. Next, said Liv, the content changed. Look at this, Gene thought. Another leap in bioprinting. They seem to be coming every day. Whole animals could now be created. The body was printed bottom to top all at once. Took about 6 days. The spleen was the biggest problem for a while, but they solved that. DNA built right in. Right now, there was an adult male making the interview circuit who claimed to be the genetic descendant of Jesus Christ. Claims he was printed from DNA provided by a relic that had been the collection of some super trillionaire. I saw that guy on QVC the other night selling Reddit, said Liv. He already has like 100 million followers on Snapbook. It turns out that, as our author explains, that the division between government and business has dissolved. Business is government and vice versa. This is a very funny book. Talking about a piece of clothing bought from Amazon Saks Fifth Avenue, or someone complained, I went to Burning Man, before they took the heart out of it. And then we find out that there are there's In-N-Out Burning Man franchises. So everyone can, have the Burning Man experience. We also we're introduced to an art. Almost everything in this Brave New World is artificial. The food is all artificial, almost entirely. Artificial realms, rooms, lawns, pools, etc., life forms can be created. And it is difficult. It is difficult to distinguish between real and fake, between human and not. And let's see, I'll give you an example. We learn of a strange creature called Lucifer, an artificial iguana. And Lucifer is a kind of, partly real, partly fake creature, which may be, heuristic. It may have its own neural net. Everyone is connected. Well, everyone in, what is considered to be civilization is connected to the cloud. Now, the people who live in, let's say, Trump country, there's a great many of them who want nothing to do with electronics. And when Arthur and his fellow masters of the universe find out about this, they shiver in horror. And we're not that far from that these days. I've only had a cell phone of any kind until 2 years ago. And I didn't want to. Essentially, Twitter demanded, Twitter and PayPal demanded that I get a smartphone. So I had to do it. But, so what, you don't have a cell phone? You don't have a smartphone? It was close to a shudder, even back then. Well, how do you relate to the world then? Well, I have a desktop computer, I don't need to be relating to the web at all times. Why not? Why not? Something important could happen. Really? Like what? But I don't know. This iguana, Lucifer or Lucy, is quite a grotesque creature who becomes, apparently it can make sounds like woof. But later we find out that it is much more intelligent than that, and seems to want to become more intelligent. This world is full of various floating devices, which serve to aid people, but also to surveil them. I suppose there is no privacy when everything you know or your database is known to the database itself. But of course, this is good for people. This is the basis on which this is all sold. This is all helpful. If we know what people are thinking all the time, then, for instance, when people are harboring murderous thoughts, we can deal with them before they happen. Now, we find out from a fellow called Mort, perhaps a little too on the nose, that everyone being attracted to the cloud, it's led to problems, serious motivational problems. That I've talked about this question of assortative mating before. Assortative mating is that men increasingly are marrying women who are just like them, and vice versa. But we see this going beyond marriage or coupling. People increasingly only associating with people who share all their interests and their opinions. Now, this was difficult before the internet, but now it becomes easy. But this leads to, when you're never going to run into a person or an opinion or a thought which is going to offend you or stimulate you, then people become rather ossified. But Arthur has big plans for the world, for the solar system. But he has to face off against Jean, who is, literally the ghost in the machine. And it turns out that there is a burgeoning rebellion in what we will call Trump country against the very monstrousness of all this. Again, I'll go back to the question I asked at the beginning. Do people really want to live forever? Do people really want to have, 10 wives? Or, I broke up with my girlfriend. What is she, number 56? Yes, the pain. Really? Are you really feeling that much pain? How many jobs are you going to be fired from? How many disappointments are you going to suffer in life before you don't feel anything anymore? I'll just conclude by saying, repeating what I said at the beginning, this book is delightful, hilarious, surprising, so thought-provoking. It is one of the best novels I have read in a long time. So, of course, it has my highest recommendation. And, of course, the book, again, is called Immortal Life, a true, soon-to-be true story by Stanley Bing. And let's have a final look at the chat. Dan asks, is there a character called Klaus Schwab in this book? Yo Mama says, assortative living was an aspect of pre-war Dutch society. Catholics, Protestants, and socialists lived in 3 different worlds. Well, yes, of course, but, I'm thinking in terms of class. You see this as assortative mating, more class-based than it's ever been. Oh, yes, you're a university graduate. I'm a university graduate. You have a postgraduate degree. I have a postgraduate degree. You're a lawyer. You're a doctor, et cetera, et cetera. It used to be the case that, successful men, they would marry their secretaries, although that still happens. It's, largely on a sexual basis. A man wants someone younger or prettier, Or a man would, when people used to go into banks because there were no ATMs, that men would spy pretty tellers, and they'd begin to talk to them, and maybe they'd date them, and maybe they'd marry them. The fact that successful man, had 20 IQ points on the teller, it wasn't such a big deal, because the idea was that no one thought that every child had to be a genius then. Let's see. Picasso 88 says, I saw the movie pretty good. When it was in the theater, there was a black guy who yelled out, "Don't do it, Superman," when Reeve was about to kiss Michael Caine. Oh, I see. Yeah, what is that? Is that called Sleuth? Is that what it's called? Okay. What else do we have here? John S. says, beginning to think people should start giving their infants to the Amish to raise. Have you ever read or seen his play Death Trap? Very funny, says Anran. Is it Death Trap or Sleuth? I always get those brothers confused. What, the Schaffer brothers? I appeared in one of their plays in high school. What was it called? Black comedy, I think. Here's the gag. That it's supposed to be a power failure and there's no light, but the stage is lighted. So we see people stumbling around in the dark, only it's not dark, but to the characters it's dark. That's the gag. It was a long time ago. Hello to Professor Paul. And let's talk about what's coming up next week. On Theater Thursday, I'm going to be discussing a Japanese classic from 1953, Ugetsu, by Kenji Mizoguchi. And coming up after that, Kiss Me Stupid by Billy Wilder, The Florida Project, directed by Sean Baker, and George Axelrod's Lord Love a Duck. On the book club next week, I am going to be discussing a military memoir of a man who lived a very interesting and unusual life. His name was Peter Kemp, and it's called No Colors or Crest. And a week after that, I'll be discussing A Short History of Canada by Desmond Morton, and then The Annals of Unsolved Crime by the endlessly inventive Edward J. Epstein. And then on July the 16th, Amy Chua's World on Fire. This Music Monday was delayed for a week, but on this Monday, I will be discussing Bertolt Goldschmidt Rediscovered. And then following that, I'm going to discuss the phenomenon of a band that was not successful during its lifetime and since become quite successful indeed, the Velvet Underground. On June the 28th, I'm going to be discussing Serge Gainsbourg, The Genius as Pervert. On July the 5th, I'll talk about the Second Vienna School. And on July the 12th, since it's Sparks year, July 12th is going to be It's a Sparks Show Tonight. Thank you all for tuning in. If you like the show or any part of it, I'd appreciate if you click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. If you would like to support this live stream with a donation, which would be, life-giving. Let's put it that way. No exaggeration at this point. My PayPal account is attached to Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. Once again, Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. If you're in Canada, donations to the live stream, again, much needed at this point, can be made directly via interact@kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this benediction. In these days of social atomization and societal collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.